Picture this. You're stuffed into a sack, alive. A snake, a dog, and a monkey are in there with you. The sack is bound, and you're suspended in the air and tossed into a river. You struggle, but the animals are fighting to survive too. Water pours in. You're drowned, along with the animals. This was not a horror movie scene. It was called poena cullei, an ancient Roman punishment. And that's just one of the scary methods the Romans used to punish criminals, traitors, and resistors of the Roman Empire. Today we learn about the worst, most nefarious techniques of Roman torture. They didn't merely execute criminals, they publicized them. Public punishment wasn't justice, it was control, it was spectacle. And the people? Everybody on the streets. The Roman Empire wasn't marble columns and victory. It was making sure that nobody ever dared to ask the emperor. And what happens if you do? Oh, the Romans could make sure you never would so again. Let us start with one of the most infamous Roman forms of capital punishment, crucifixion, most correlated with the manner in which Jesus Christ died. But it was much more than that. The Romans had sumptuously refined crucifixion, and it was designed to be lengthy, painful, and humiliating. Crucifixion was not just killing someone, it was torturing them too. Not only were the victims pinned to the cross, but they were pinned through the wrists and ankles. The nails were not put in the hands because the body would collapse too quickly. No, these nails were put into the wrists, the part that could hold body weight for longer. It took a long time. It would be days, even hours, before the victim would finally succumb. And it wasn't a quick death. The lungs of the victim would become filled with water. They would fight for air, and sometimes they would drown because their own bodies were pulling on the cross. They would fight all this and be weathered out in public view, begging for mercy. That is crucifixion, but the Romans possessed a whole range of torture techniques. Take scaphism, for all its Persian origins, definitely used by the Romans and executed using the very same device far too regularly. Imagine this. One was bound between two boats, secured in this horrific, cramped environment. Milk and honey were placed on their body, tempting flies and insects to cluster and feed on exposed flesh. They would torment them to death, and most often by disease, for the insects ate them alive. And then there was the method of burning alive. Traitors, arsonists, and anyone who threatened Rome could be sentenced to being burned alive. Sometimes criminals were put inside a metal bull, an empty statue, and ignited. The screams of the victim were piped through the mouth of the bull, so it seemed like the bull itself was screaming in pain. These weren't executions. These were ghastly spectacles intended to scare anyone who would be fool enough to resist the empire. But here is the gruesome truth. These tortures were not as much about punishment as they were about fear. The Roman Empire did not care to kill individuals. They cared to make an example. The example was this: resist us, and you will suffer before the whole world. It was a tool of social control, brilliantly designed to hold people in bondage. Rome was the most magnificent empire on this planet, and they knew very well that fear was one of their strongest tools to keep subjects in subordination. Crucifixion, live burning, limb tearing by beasts in the arena. These were not moments of random brutality. These were carefully chosen ways to shame and kill the victim. If you were condemned to death in such a way, you weren't dying with honor. You were dying as an example. One of the worst aspects, the crowd. The Romans knew how to make something worthwhile. These murders were public spectacles, entertainment for the masses. It was not so much the killing as it was showing the people that Rome was listening, that Rome was in control. The crowds were urged to applaud, to chant, to be part of the spectacle, and the more suffering, the more reinforcement that to defy the emperor was not something to be done. You would think that only criminals were tortured and executed, but in Rome, the lower born were not the only ones to get the treatment. Some of the best documented Roman victims of torture were elites themselves, nobles, soldiers, and high-ranking officials. For example, slaves could be tortured before ever being allowed to testify in court. They weren't afforded the same rights as citizens under the law. Their testimony would not be heard unless it had been extracted from them under the threat of suffering, and this was perfectly okay. This was just how things were. But even Roman citizens, especially those who had fallen out of favor, were not safe. If you were a senior official who had fallen into disfavor with the emperor, either charged with treason or simply seen as a threat to the throne, you could be forced to a public execution intended to shame you, your family, and your followers. Look at the example of Sejanus, a top officer who served under Emperor Tiberius. Sejanus was accused of conspiracy against the emperor and was executed in a public spectacle. His corpse was dragged through the streets, openly exposed, and thrown into the Tiber River. His children were killed. His entire family was wiped out, not just as a punishment for Sejanus, but as a warning to others who would tread his path. That was a deliberate form of cruelty. Impressing punishment on individuals wasn't really even the intention. It was keeping the entire empire going. And so is the question, are we really past this? Are we so essentially different from ancient Rome? Think about it. We don't burn human beings alive anymore and crucify them in town centers, but are we still living in a politics of fear? We've refined the art more and gotten better technology, but the urge to silence people through fear or humiliation is never absent. In other places, citizens disappear during the night. Careers and lives are left wrecked on a wave of public humiliation. The show has only changed, but not disappeared. And so, I suppose, in a way, the Roman Empire didn't really leave us after all. It's just human nature. It's just what we do in an attempt to keep things under control. And if we're not careful, history will repeat itself anew and in unsuspected form. Now think about it. Having learned about the terrible tortures and murders of ancient Rome, do you think we've learned anything from history? Or do you think there are still some elements of this control through fear at work today? Leave your comments below. I always reply to them and love hearing your thoughts. If you enjoy this dive, don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on that little bell icon so that you can stay up to date with all our future dives into the deep crevices of history. Always remember to stay curious, questioning, and never forget, history has a nasty habit of repeating itself whenever we don't remember its lessons. Thanks to all for watching.